Hi everyone, and welcome to the Urgency Care Clinic of the Simio Hospital. We want to welcome all of you, the new caregivers of this clinic, to the new staff training program, where you will learn all about the clinic. The topics that we'll be discussing today are the assumptions taken inside the clinic, how does the clinic function on a daily basis, restrictions and constraints, approaches taken, suggested possible scenarios, validation that it does work correctly, and lastly, the results. Before we begin, it's important that you understand the terms we will be using in the class. The first one is patients. When we say patients, we mean entities in the system. Second, we say caregivers when we mean workers. And lastly, we refer to the urgency care clinic as simply clinic. So what do we take for granted inside the clinic, which for all of us employees is normal? We take a few assumptions. As we can see, the hospital, it has its urgency care clinic on its right. Once we go in, we have the registration area where clients enter the clinic, then the waiting room on the right, the triage area where nurses are, then we have the exam rooms, and the procedure rooms. Lastly, the ambulance, which takes patients that need emergency treatment, and these are taken to the hospital in front. Now, the restrictions and constraints of the model. Now, the approaches taken to solve the clinic's daily challenges. When a patient is created, it is assigned randomly from a table which type of patient it is, as well as a sequence with the order of rooms it has to follow. Two distinct kinds of caregivers are created to each of the 7 types of caregivers there are, an early and late shift. When the day begins on run initialized, a property is assigned to every caregiver state variable to specify the amount of each type of caregiver. After this, it creates this amount of caregivers and each of them is assigned to the basic node, where they will be at while off shift. Given that each patient does different things inside each server, a task sequence is given to patients and it associates a caregiver for each of these tasks. To solve the waiting room issue, a server was created with no processing time along with 2 transfer nodes that are connected to the server's output nodes. One transfer node only allows entities going to the exam room to pass, while the other one allows entities going to the procedure rooms using a selection wait. Each transfer node has its own queue where patients wait until a nurse is free to take them where they need, using a selection condition. A nurse can only take a patient if either the exam rooms or procedure rooms, depending where they're headed, have capacity to process them. If not, they wait. To calculate the patients that leave without being seen, a process is run to determine if the time that patients have in the clinic since they enter the register room exceeds the time that they were willing to wait in the clinic. If affirmative, they are sent to the sink and the state variable of leave without being seen adds 1 more to its count. Some patients, according to their sequence table, need to leave the clinic in an ambulance after visiting the triage room. There are 3 cost sources, one from the normal work schedule in the clinic, one from the usage of the exam room and procedure rooms, and one from the extra time worked by the caregivers. To get the total cost, a response is added in an experiment which adds the values. To consider cost for caregivers working after 10 p.m., first a 0 has been set in their cost multiplier inside the work schedule. Later, when the last patient leaves the system and it stops on run ending, a state variable is used to calculate the extra time used prior to 10 p.m. and it rounds it up to the next hour. Lastly, it multiplies it by the cost per extra hour. Since there are patients that stay after 10 p.m. in the clinic, caregivers had to stay as well. For this, the clinic was modeled for 1 entire day until midnight and a stopping condition was used, as well as a tally statistic that is constantly evaluating if the model can stop. It can only stop if 2 conditions are met. The first one is if it is after 10 p.m. and the second one if there are any patients left in the system. Some of you have kindly sent a few suggestions that were taken in mind so that the clinic can function in a better way. We have tested a few cases. The results given by each case will be given at the end, where we will conclude which one is the best one. So, the first one is allowing activities that require exam rooms to be done in procedure rooms. For this, the weight of every path that leads to these rooms was changed so that patients that need an exam room, and these are busy, could go to the available procedure rooms. A special task sequence was created for this. Once the patients have entered the procedure room instead, they proceed as they would in the exam room. For this, a new state variable was created in the model entity where the value of 1 was saved if the patients used this new feature, or the value of 0 was saved if they used the original version of the paths. The assumptions for these were that the resources used and the time taken inside the procedure room is the same as though they are in the exam rooms. The second scenario is allowing the other caregivers types to tend to patients. For these lists with new priorities were created where new caregivers can see more types of patients and do more tasks than before. And so there is not only one type of caregiver for each type of task. The assumptions for these are we took the same cases given you suggested. Number 3, allowing more flexible shift patterns like part-time givers. A part-time caregiver for each type was created when the model began, and were assigned and saved on a state variable, just like the rest of the workers. Then, on most of the model's processes and lists that have the specific tasks for each worker used by the task sequences, these part-time workers were added as well. The assumptions are that the model only uses part-time workers if two conditions are met. One, when there is a peak arrival of patients, usually 10 or 11 patients at the time, and 2, if there is only one full-time caregiver of that type, either early shift or late shift. If there are 2 or more, the model assumes it doesn't need any part-time givers. Scenario number 4 is having on-call orthopedic physicians. In this case, the orthopedic physicians was left on call all day, every day, from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. To do this, one single caregiver of this type was left inside the clinic. Its cost was reduced to 50%, and in the sequence table, an extra 30 minutes of delay were added to represent the time it took for them to arrive to the clinic. If the orthopedic physician is needed after 10 p.m., they are paid 150% of their salary. And the last scenario is what you wanted to know what happens if a mass accident occurs near the clinic. A new source was created, source mass accident, to create the patients that were going to arrive after the accident nearby. This source is activated once a day, every day, randomly in an event that lasts 15 minutes where 30 patients arrive. A sequence table was created to assign a mix that allows 25% of patients from type 3 to 6 to arrive. This increases the cost of the hospital around 30%. To reduce this, we thought of firstly asking support of nearby clinics to reduce the amount of patients that arrive, and secondly to have the off-shift caregivers of the clinic to be called to work in this emergency. Moving on, the validation of the model. First of all, we mixed the information given of the 9 kinds of patients and their arrival rates. After this, we got the amount of patients that arrived per hour according to their sickness rounded up. With this information, the amount needed per hour of every caregiver was calculated. However, this does not apply for the exam room or procedure rooms because their costs are given by its use. So we only need to count how many patients used each room to calculate this cost. Now, we know how many caregivers we need for each shift. We multiply by its cost and the hours worked in a day. Then this by 30, and we have the cost per month. It is important to point out that for the validation, we have not taken into account the extra hours, which are an extra cost, or the queues or the patients that leave without being seen, which imply an increase in caregivers and therefore in cost. So this is only an approximation. Now the results of the original model of the clinic, as well as the results of the recommendations made to see which scenario works best for the clinic in every way. As predicted, the data of the original model is very close, yet higher than the validation results. From the possible scenarios, we can observe that Model 1 and Model 2 reduce the total cost of the clinic compared to the original model. On the other hand, Model 3 and 4 increase the total cost of the original model, and so these are discarded. The last scenario of having extra patients due to a mass accident increases the cost a lot because there are not enough caregivers, and so queues increment as well. After this, we recommend to train caregivers to do more tasks than they already do. We recommend to allow procedure rooms to be used as exam rooms. We recommend to create a business alliance with other hospitals nearby to help the clinic in case of emergencies. Also, instead of having a lot of caregivers tend a patient, one single caregiver should be able to take a patient through the entire process. Patients need to visit the registration area when they arrive and when they leave, so by omitting the last visit to this area may fasten the process. And lastly, we recommend that patients don't need to be accompanied by a nurse in order to go to the procedure or exam rooms, because there are cases in which the caregivers from these areas are free, but there are no available nurses that can take the patients where they need. Thank you everyone for your attention, and if you don't have any more questions, you can get started.